Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Manic Manor podcast. This is Mitchie. Today's episode, we are going to talk about one of the lesser-known massacres that happened during the Vietnam War, and that is the Ha My massacre. Now, the Vietnam War was known for being pretty much the unwinnable war. Neither side really saw a victory. And 1968 was a year that saw such a plethora of abominations involving many massacres and war settings within Vietnam. Now we'll talk about the Ha My massacre. Now Ha My was a village in the Dien Ban district of the Quang Nam province of South Vietnam. This village, much like the entirety of Vietnam at this time, was subjected to the gruesome reality of war as the Americans, South Koreans, Australians, New Zealanders, and others helped South Vietnam fight against North Vietnam and the Vietcong. As I mentioned earlier, this was a war in which everyone lost, and lost in immense travesty, and there were countless massacres and murders, but not one so well known was the Ha My village massacre. Southern and central Vietnam were known as free fire zones, meaning that any and all objects or persons in this area were subject to being targets of destruction or just essentially being shot at. Most of the time, these were innocent villagers who were simply just trying to survive and live their lives during wartime, but a lot of times they would be considered to be sympathizers with the Vietcong. No lives were to be spared, and it was extremely widespread, and it didn't matter what your age was, your gender, nor your social status. If you were out there, you were free game. Some of the destruction were at the hands of what is known as the Blue Dragons, or the 2nd Marine Division as it's known in Korea. They were a physical bunch of men in the Marines who would do Taekwondo for PT sessions, were very aggressive to say the least in what they did. One thing that they were known for was close combat and an overuse of their firepower. They were there to just take out communists and any sympathizers. Unfortunately, the Ha My village would meet the brunt end of this, and this meant absolute trouble. So on the day of February 25th, 1968, horror would enter this farmland village. The Blue Dragons, in anger and retaliation, would storm into the village, supposedly because there was a mortar fire on 6 Korean soldiers caused by the Vietcong, killing all of the soldiers involved, including a captain and first sergeant. Now, the Blue Dragons stormed into Ha My with around, about 200 Marines, and in their fashion of close combat began an onslaught of complete slaughter. Of these victims, there were roughly 135 women and children as well as elders, the oldest being in their mid-80s and the youngest being merely infants. One survivor of the massacre, who we know as Nguyen Thi Thanh, heard screaming as the attack began, and saw as the village caught fire with smoke rising up into the sky, and as she ran, she was met with the end gun of a Korean dragon. Her home was raided, and her entire family, including extended family with her as well, were ordered into an underground shelter in their yard. Once the entire family was huddled inside, Nguyen said that the grenades that the dragons had on them were tossed in right behind them. Her aunt and her infant cousin were some of the first to die, and they died immediately upon impact. Now, her mother shielded her and her brother, crying out to them, and in her final words, she said to them, "My babies, we are doomed." Of the entire family, only Nguyen and a cousin had survived, but they were so badly injured that they stayed hidden and then crawled from the wreckage to find a neighbor to get help. As Nguyen remembered, she said that she felt numb and was completely covered in blood. Now, out of this entire village, only about a dozen managed to survive, and this was a village of a little over 150 people. They had no reason not to trust these soldiers initially, though, because these soldiers, the Blue Dragons, they had visited many times before looking for the Vietcong, and to the survivors, it was a shock and a nightmare that they would never wake up from. They wonder to this day why it was such a different turn of events, how things could turn on such a dime when just weeks prior they had been there offering the children chocolate and snacks, and the very children that they were offering the snacks to just a few weeks ago were the very children that they were tossing grenades at and killing. And as if to add gasoline to the fire, after a nearly 4-hour massacre, the Marines came and bulldozed shallow graves to bury the bodies atop of each other before coming back and napalming the evidence to show what they had done. The bodies were simply just put into these shallow mass graves, and it said that the people of Hami were murdered twice, first in the raid, and second when they came back to hide their wrongdoing. Now, for Wen, she didn't see this immediately. The surviving family member did, though, as Wen was taken to the hospital to recover because her injuries were much more extensive. She ended up actually going deaf in her left ear, and she had shrapnel piercing her body. So while she was recovering in a nearby hospital, her cousin was one of the few people that was left to try to pick up the pieces of their village and take the bodies to try to give them somewhat of a, decent burial before the Korean dragons came in with the bulldozers and the napalms and just completely desecrated their graves. And anybody who knows about Asian culture knows, especially in older times, that desecrating a grave, even in the United States today, any kind of common sense would tell you the desecration of a grave is the utmost sign of disrespect that you can do to a person. So, in 2001, there was a memorial made in the village to commemorate the victims, and that was funded by a South Korean veteran group. But it was a bittersweet meeting. The initial memorial they had erected had a poem about the war condemning the actions of the Koreans. Now, they ended up covering up this poem with a lotus flower mural, but it originally read, 500 years ago, the descendants of Lak Long Kwan and Uko crossed the Hwangson Range and founded a country here. These benevolent and good-natured people bore and raised children and worked from the land with plows and hoes, growing vegetables and catching fish to live off. In the early spring of 1968, soldiers rounded up and slaughtered the villagers. Pieces of bodies of 135 people from 30 families were scattered everywhere, and the village was painted red with blood. The sand became mixed with bone, tangled corpses hung from pillars of houses set on fire, and ants crawled over their burnt flesh. The bodies of elderly mothers and sick fathers lay together in the doorways. When we hastily piled up the bodies, all were ridden with bullets. The bodies were covered in pools of dried blood, and babies crawled onto the stomachs of their deceased mothers to nurse at their cold bosoms. Some children who had their mouths and chins blown off were unable to drink in spite of their thirst. The Koreans who had left us with so much grief came back and apologized to us. We erected a memorial stone based on forgiveness, thereby opening a path for development and cooperation in our homeland. As a line of incense smoke wafts up to the sky, we hope they are resting in peace on the other side. Now, in April of 2022, survivors had submitted a petition to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Korea, demanding that the truth be revealed to the public. It went silent for a year before the commission dismissed the application on May 24th of 2023. They seamlessly claimed that there wasn't any likelihood of harm done to the Hami village, in what they called a simple incident. But the survivors would beg to differ. However, nearby villages had won lawsuits and succeeding in some form of compensation and an apology from the Korean government. However, there hasn't been much of a massive formal apology, although there are some senators in Korea today that are pushing for the realization to come forth. Now, regardless of your beliefs on war, especially those of the Vietnam War and the horrendous actions that were committed in battle, the lives of the Hami village were forever tainted with horrific memories and lessons that no war is ever won. So I want to thank you guys for listening in on this short episode today. If there's anything that you would like to add on or anything that I have gotten wrong, please feel free to correct me, especially on the pronunciation. You can reach out to manicmanorpodcast@gmail.com. You can also reach out on Facebook and Instagram at Manic Manor Podcast. You can comment on YouTube as well, Manic Manor Podcast. And if you feel so inclined, we do have a Patreon set up, patreon.com/Manic Manor Podcast, for you to donate if you feel so inclined to. Until the next episode, I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.